with Cape Media News Conversations. I'm Sarah Colvin. Very pleased to welcome today in studio our Cape and Island State Senator Julian Cyr. Senator Cyr, I was going to call you Julian. Thank you so much.
Please call me Julian, and it's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. So, was just looking on Facebook the day that we're taping this and celebrating some success in terms of bringing a housing court here to Cape Cod. So, congratulations, and tell me a little bit about what that means.
Thank you. So this is a big victory for the region and actually for a number of counties that have been underserved by housing courts. So we actually know the trial court has figured out over recent years that when you have courts that deal with, a drug court, housing courts, there's actually a mental health court in Plymouth, you really can kind of pull together not only resources of the court, but advocates, agencies, folks really help people. And so this has been something that we've really fought for in the Senate to expand housing courts. I advocated for this in the budget, in the FY18 budget that we passed. Senator Karen Spilka, who's the chair of Ways and Means, she's a big fan of this as well. So new housing courts are opening in Barnstable, several in Western Mass, and one in Western Metro West, I believe, as well. And so this is going to be a real opportunity. So this was sort of the rollout meeting. So Chief Justice from the trial court attended. I was there. Representative Dylan Fernandez as well attended, but a really big crowd of folks. You talk about housing as an issue on the Cape, and people turn up. It's on a lot of people's minds.
It's one of our top 10 issues. So what will the housing court do? Will this allow people who are maybe having issues with their housing, tenant-landlord disputes, that sort of thing,
Precisely,
be able
right?
to?
So for instance, you are someone who is late on your rent, right? And the housing court can kind of step in, and instead of going through, it's like going through a specialized process, right?
Right.
So if there's an eviction, looking at tenants' rights, how do you really help connect someone who maybe is struggling to pay the rent, who has some other issues and challenges going on? How do you make sure that you're going through the litigation and those processes, but also making sure that folks have a roof under their head, right? Housing sort of, I'm a public health guy, that's where my background is. Housing is just one of those core kind of tenets of health and wellness, and I think particularly if you look at, given the really high real estate prices we have here, you've had a lot of compression, right? So maybe folks who are middle income, workforce people, housing's so expensive, affordable rentals are so scarce, they're kind of taking up and eating up a lot of the market. So there's a lot of compression, especially on the most vulnerable. So we're hopeful that a housing court's going to be able to connect people who are really struggling on housing and connect them to services in a way that's innovative.
Great. And what did people with issues do before? Did they just go through small claims court? They didn't have these kind of educated advocates there to help them through these very complicated issues.
That's exactly it, right? And so, and this is actually something that's been done in other counties. There's been a lot of success, to it. So instead of having, a series of one-off cases, another example of how this works really well is the drug court in Barnstable County under Judge Julian, really, I've attended some of the drug courts, and it's pretty powerful because you see the whole kind of court is focused on people who are dealing with addiction, and so I think the more and I'm not a criminal justice person, but the more we learn about how people navigate our criminal justice system, the more we realize that specialized courts really help people and also have the outcomes are better. For both folks on both ends of a dispute. So something I'm glad to have been part of. This has been a long time coming, so certainly prior to my tenure here, but glad to see the housing court. We're finally going to have it here on the Cape.
So staying on the topic of housing, of course, we've had the Housing Court and the Cape Cod Commission recently released a housing market study, taking a broad look at some of those big issues and looking into where we can kind of fill in the missing pieces in terms of helping to solve this housing crisis. Of course, I think we can call it a crisis. We have a large number of second homeowners taking up a lot of properties. Property prices are incredibly expensive. We have a small amount of rentals and more people than housing that's available. So what was your take on the housing study, and how is it going to help you as a legislator form policy?
So the housing study is fantastic because what it does, right, is it crystallizes, I think, what we all kind of know but haven't kind of put into numbers, and is that we need, just to support the existing population we have here today, we need 26,000 plus additional units. Not 26. That's like talking about churro. Just 26 for churro. So, over 26,000 units are needed. That's new build, accessory dwelling units, repurposing of housing. But given that we've got this pretty out of whack real estate market here, right? So because there's such demand for second homes, we've actually been building a lot of homes here on the Cape, but a vast majority of those homes are being bought by people who don't live here.
Right.
And so that has, I think what's helpful with the housing study is it gives sort of town officials and advocates, and this really is something that, I'll talk a little bit about what we're trying to do at the state level, but it's really in addressing this crisis, there's some ready-made solutions that we can have right here in our communities. So it gives you, as someone who's on the select board or the planning board, it gives you kind of a hard number and a town by town number saying, all right, we need, okay, this, maybe this 800 units in our town to really help meet demand. So I think the specificity there, but having that tangible number you can latch on to, I hope is really helpful. It's helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for other town leaders. I think the other, piece of this for the, I just lost my train of thought.
For what you're in terms of what you're working on in the legislature, or in terms of what it means for us here?
You're right. So at the state level, zoning reform is really crucial. So
Huge.
If you look at how our zoning has been structured, sort of post-war on, all our development has been built in 1 acre or 2 acre single-family lots with a Title V septic system that has huge strains on our environment, on traffic. And it's also not indigenous to our communities, right? We're here in, right nearby downtown Dennisport, right? If you think of a quintessential Cape Village, it's a walkable, tight community. Our zoning currently doesn't allow for that. So at the state level, I actually chair the committee, one of the committees that's looking at this issue. I chair the Committee on Community Development and Small Business. And so we have a bill before us that looks at comprehensive zoning reform and housing production. So that means ideas like accessory dwelling unit, having those be allowed by right, looking at multi-use and multi-story development in certain centers in each of our communities. So this is what we're looking to do at the state level. Representative Sarah Peak, is a sponsor of this effort on the House side. But for the Cape, there's a lot of what we're talking about, what's talked about statewide around affordable housing. We've got a whole different challenge on our hands, right? You make 140, 160% of area median income. You can't afford to buy a house here.
No way.
So, and this, and I know this, and I think the other piece that's really important to talk about housing, because people think about housing, and I think they think of people who might be you're in my age bracket, and this is a big challenge for young families on the Cape. It's also a challenge for older adults and for seniors.
Absolutely.
Because there's such a limited amount of housing stock for folks to downsize into. So, I look at my parents, for example, who, are quite active and they're pretty young. They're in their early 60s, but, they live in this antique house. It's a lot of work. They probably would be better served by something that's a condo or something that's kind of easier to manage. Those options don't exist for them. Certainly don't exist on the Outer Cape. And if you do the math right now of what your property's worth and the math in sort of downsizing, it just doesn't work. And so folks are left kind of holding on to their properties. It's sort of the one asset they have. And so we've got to focus on housing not only for young families, but for older adults. And by the way, if older adults are able to downsize, that frees up homes for young families.
And that's something that the Cape Cod Commission study really pointed to, was older people who are kind of staying in homes that may have been big enough for their families. Now they're by themselves,
Yep.
or just the two of them, and there really is no place for them to downsize or to move. So that kind of takes that particular piece of property off the market.
Yep.
When it could be available to a young family. So it's an interesting, that was one of the things that I saw in the study that I found was fascinating, something you don't think about.
Yeah,
That's here on the
exactly.
Cape.
And that I think what's really important is that we're going to be doing our work at the state level, but I feel like this is something that we've been talking about as a community since I was in middle school, which is actually quite a long ways from now at this point. But
Last year.
No, definitely not. But that's like 2000. But also that a lot of these solutions lie in our community. And that it really matters, and really I'm encouraging people to step up and attend your local planning board meeting, look at signing on and participating in one of these boards. Tonight I'm going to be meeting, it's a joint meeting of the Dennis Board of Selectmen with the planning board, so we can talk about these issues. And I think it's really important that folks realize that we we have this really direct form of representative representative meetings and town meeting, and we can come together. And so really encouraging people to speak up, especially in housing. I think we can do it. The Cape Cod Commission report shows this is within reach, but we've got to be aggressive and creative.
And this is really where we need voices to be heard. I think the folks that need the housing, whether they're older adults or our young families, do need to know. And I thank you for bringing up that issue of civic engagement, because it is so important. And we are still lucky here in Massachusetts to have that participatory government, but it's not participatory unless you participate.
Yeah, you got to show up, and it requires a lot of time and effort. I think though that I found that when you show up, people respond, and it does seem that this is an issue that I think increasingly more and more people are getting, that housing is so crucial, not only to who we are as a community, but I think to our economic development, right?
Absolutely.
And so if you look at the needs of what we're going to have as a community, I like to look at healthcare, right? And a lot of healthcare work, which we have and we need. We have an aging population. A lot of these are good-paying jobs. But you sit down with the CEO of Cape Cod Healthcare, or you talk to the community health centers, or the nurses, the Visiting Nurses Association. One of their biggest concerns is finding housing for their staff. So I think that the other piece is that because housing has become so expensive, this used to be a place where folks had come, my family kind of washed ashore like so many folks. You're able to build a life, start a business. The barrier to entry was a lot lower, and what's changed is the cost of housing. And so that's kind of a piece I think that really does tie in, and I think that we need to be doing more on.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about criminal justice. We're going to totally switch gears. Criminal justice reform,
Yep.
I know that there's been some recent changes in that. Tell me a little bit of what's going on in there and how that'll impact us.
Massachusetts often likes to fashion ourselves as sort of a national leader on a whole host of issues. This is not the case on criminal justice reform. So a whole host of other states have already moved forward on a bunch of common sense solutions, looking at repeals of mandatory minimums, looking at bail reform, a whole host of reforms that the current system that we've had, and many states have had across the country, ends up keeping people within the correctional system in a way that doesn't result in good outcomes for them and costs, the Commonwealth costs the state a chunk of money. And so the Senate just took up comprehensive criminal justice reform. We were in session till 1:30 in the morning.
Oh my!
Actually, last Thursday, so which is good. We're doing the work. But this is really an effort, actually, to catch up with a number of other states. Actually, most of these states are red states who've really moved towards comprehensive criminal justice reform. Yes, because it results in better outcomes for people who are incarcerated in our system, but also because it saves so much resources and money.
So what are some of the key issues that you're trying to repair in terms of the problems, the holes in our system?
In the Senate bill that we voted on, there's a repeal of mandatory minimums for certain drug offenses, right? For possession, not for trafficking. So trafficking of drugs like cocaine and heroin, there still is a mandatory minimum. Looking at bail reform, right? So that often if you talk to the folks who run our jails, people will often be stuck in jail because they can't pay bail that is set at maybe $1,500 or even at $500. So how do we make it so that people aren't stuck in our system? There's also a look at how do you make sure that if you look at people who are involved in the correctional system and recidivism, right, who repeats, who are repeat offenders, they tend to be people who are younger folks, right, sort of 17, 18, 19,
right.
20, 21, who are caught into the criminal justice system, who may be incarcerated and then come back out. So how do we really divert these young people into the juvenile justice system, which is actually a health agency, and not into the correctional system, which is run through a whole different set of agencies. I filed legislation to actually filed an amendment that was successful that would allow probation officers to specialize in serving 18 to 26-year-olds with certain programming and have a certain level of expertise. But it's an omnibus bill. There's a heck of a lot more in there.
I'm sure. But I think about the younger kids, and certainly we hear so often that you get thrown into the system at an early age, and that just kind of brings you a life of crime just because of the contact that you have. So kind of doing that early intervention and doing it more from a service resource standpoint and a help standpoint than a punishment standpoint is certainly important, and to make sure that these kids get better instead of go into a life of crime.
Yeah, and often we're talking about, you know, we're not talking about serious crimes, we're like, you know, murder and a whole list of capital crimes, right? Those actually remain pretty significant penalties. But in the omnibus bill we passed, basically saying, look, we're going to consider you a juvenile through your full 18th year. So right now, you know, if you are 18 in a day, you can be charged differently than you know, two or 3 days prior when you were 17 and 363
right.
days. And so just to extend that, to make sure that we're pulling more folks into the juvenile justice system, you know, if I had my kind of druthers, and I think where we're going is to have a system that looks at 17 to 26-year-olds and treats them differently than certainly younger juveniles, and then also from the older prison population. I think that's where, from a developmental perspective and from a recidivism perspective, having specific programming and resources, you get, you know, again, not only for the quality of life of the individuals, to give them success in reentry, but also, again, from a cost perspective, because, you know, individuals who, you know, are involved in the criminal justice system time and time again, you know, there's a significant cost, you know, yes, to the Commonwealth, but also to our society, and that person not being a sort of fully fledged person in our community.
Sure. Let's talk about healthcare now as well. Of course, healthcare is something that on the national level getting a lot of attention. Here in Massachusetts, we've had the healthcare legislation for many years. Tell me a little bit about what we're looking at in terms of reform for our healthcare here in Massachusetts.
So if you look at, again, cost drivers, the biggest cost driver in the Commonwealth's $40 billion budget is healthcare, specifically Mass Health, our Medicaid program. That's 43% of our state budget. If you add in other health and human services, that's closer to 50%. And that's the piece. Those costs are increasing. So it's meaning that funding for everything else, whether it's emergency preparedness or health, public health, environment, you know, you sort of name it, all that sort of education, those limited resources, that's flat. And so we really got to figure out, how do we contain costs in the Commonwealth? We've done a good job making sure that you and me and 98% of us have health insurance, that 90% of us have a primary care provider. We've done well there. Where we haven't done as well is really containing the costs in our healthcare market. So there's a working group in the Senate that's put out some proposed legislation. We're going to be debating this later this month. Again, a big piece of omnibus legislation. I'm focusing on a few areas. I'm focused on expansion of services to pay for preventive care. So we had a pilot in Massachusetts, a prevention and wellness trust fund for 4 years. It was highly successful. Actually, significant resources came right here to Barnstable County on the Upper Cape, providing some help around hypertension and diabetes and falls prevention. So working to renew that. Also looking for us to really seriously look at the promise of looking at a whole other way of doing business, right? So most industrialized nations have some sort of broadly covered healthcare, and it costs a heck of a lot more than the healthcare that we have. And so, you know, I hear from a lot of constituents who want sort of the Commonwealth to move sort of immediately to a single payer system. And I'm really intrigued by the promise of single payer as well. But as someone who's studied and worked in health in the Commonwealth, you know, I like to kind of describe our healthcare system and all the mandates and regulations and components that we have around it. You know, those balls of elastic bands that you get at Staples. That's like, to me, that's kind of the analogy of like what our healthcare system is like. And so when you're reforming it or changing it or tweaking it, right, you got to consider all of that.
Sure.
So another piece that I'm working on is looking at having the Commonwealth really study what a single payer system would cost us over 3 years, and that if it turns out that a single payer system is less costly, then we should begin to move towards that. If it turns out the other way, then we really should reconsider that. I think there's some examples. Vermont kind of pursued a single payer system for a while. The implementation was not as successful as they hoped. So I think this is something that I hear from constituents a lot on this, and I really think we've got to do our due diligence in looking at that. More broadly, the bill is going to expand access to telemedicine. We're going to expand if enacted, it would expand the authority of EMTs to provide care to folks right in their home, right? Say, you know, the older adult who sort of slips and has a, you know, has a cut or something, that they can sort of provide some care there, or maybe care at a community health center, or not go all the way to the hospital. We're trying to keep people from, you know, ending up in the emergency room if they don't need that level of care. And there's a whole host of other things on it. It's a pretty big, complex topic. But you know, I think it's something that if we don't sink our teeth into this, and if we don't continue to work at healthcare cost, it just really limits the options that we're going to have as a Commonwealth.
Absolutely. Well, Julian, if folks have questions for you, if they want to talk with you, if they would like to get in touch, what's the best way for them to do so?
So they can always be in touch with me in my office. I've got 5 great Cape Codders who work for me and help me do this job and serve folks on the Cape and Islands. So my direct line at the State House is 508. I'm sorry, it's not 508. It's 617-722-1570. And you can also email me directly. My email is julian.sear@masenate.gov.
Great. Well, Julian, thank you so much for stopping by. It's
great
always
to be
wonderful
with
to
you.
get an update.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Julian Sear, of course, a senator for the Cape and Islands District. For Cape Media News Conversations, I'm Sarah Colvin.